Hello and welcome to the Sabrina River Folk Podcast with me, Nicola Haz. Tonight's guest is Margi Bryant. Margi wrote a series of leaflets on the Severn Way through Powys for Powys County Council. She joins me tonight to tell us all about it. So, welcome to the podcast, Margi.
Thanks, Nick. It's lovely to be here.
So if we could please, Margi, could we start with a little bit about your history and background, and also sort of when you've had your first connection with the River Severn, please?
Right, yeah. This could be quite a long story. Could take up the whole podcast, actually, just history and background. I think I would say this, well, I'm sure you know the legend of the three sister rivers that rise on the mountain Plinlimmon, the Severn, the Wye and the Ystwyth. They were the three daughters of the giant who sleeps beneath the mountain. And they had a discussion among themselves when they were born about which route they would take to the sea. The Ystwyth wanted to get to sea quickly, so she chose the quickest, shortest route. The Wye wanted to take the most scenic route. So Wye sort of wended her way down to the sea that way. And the Severn just wanted to go and see all the most interesting places and go the longest way around she possibly could to see everywhere and then get to sea. So that's me, really. I really kind of identify with the Severn because I've taken have a very meandering course to my life, just like the Severn. So I grew up in Cardiff and was born and educated in Cardiff. To be honest, my first experience of the Severn was a very exciting experience being on the train going through the Severn Tunnel, long before I'd ever seen the river. And because in Cardiff, our river was the Taff, obviously. But yeah, my mother used to take me to London now and again, just for a trip when I was a child. And there was just this amazing moment on the train when everything went dark and you were hence that you were beneath the river, and it was really exciting, sort of like a boundary. So that was actually my first experience of the Severn, and then I didn't really reconnect with the Severn for a long time. I went to university in England, and after that I lived in lots of different parts of England and several places overseas as well, because I've worked in, I think as I said, I've worked in journalism, in international development, in communications, heritage work, and most recently for a university in academia. I have sort of meandered. But as part of that meandering was being commissioned to do a series of leaflets about the Severn Way in Wales, the Welsh section, which was quite a long time ago now. I have to confess the leaflets, sadly, are no longer in print because everybody uses apps these days. The leaflets are kind of a really old school, but they were a lovely thing to do, and it was a lovely commission. But it sort of came out of my sort of mixed career of doing communications work and heritage work, and also being a keen walker. Nowadays, I'm based in the Peak District, and I do freelance work for various conservation organisations, and my sort of independent project is researching a book which is going to be about the River Derwent, the one in Derbyshire. There are three others, but I think that it was the experience of doing the leaflets about the Severn Way in Wales just brought together my love of writing, my love of walking, and a fascination with rivers. And I think that was the first project I'd done that brought together those three things. And I think that's really influenced what I'm doing today. I've sort of been vaguely obsessed with rivers on and off, ever since. And I'm sure that's really generated the idea of my now writing, or trying to write, a book about my local river, the Derwent. Yeah. So that's, I sometimes say to people, long story short, but then it's never short. It's always, I always give the long version.
as you mentioned earlier, that you were instrumental in writing a series of leaflets for Powys County Council on the walking routes on the Severn Way in their particular county. So can you tell us a little bit about, you know, why Powys County Council wanted to publicise their section of the Severn Way, and how did you get involved?
Yes, great. Well, Powys County Council, all the section of the Severn Way from the source to the English-Welsh border, that's all within Powys, and it's as part of a long-distance trail. It's looked after, it's managed and looked after by Powys County Council. They're the authority that looks after it. And at that time, there were guidebooks to the whole of the Severn Way, but Powys County Council really wanted to promote that particular section to make it more obvious and available to people, to inform people about it. And I think it linked very much to a sense that, you know, we're still building on, really, this sense of how important being in nature is to people, and wanting to just absolutely maximize opportunities for people to connect with nature and have access to nature. And this was a good, you know, long before the pandemic, but it's still, you know, since the pandemic, we're all far, you know, increasingly aware of how beneficial nature is and walking in nature. But it was still, you know, it was very much felt even well before that. So they wanted. So this was a contract, and I was lucky enough to get this contract. I can't remember exactly the bidding process, but I know it was a competitive bid. What I'd been doing previously, I'd worked for Pembrokeshire Coast National Park as interpretation officer. That's not interpretation as in language, that's interpretation as in sort of communications that help people understand and enjoy the places they're visiting, or indeed the places they live in. So it's things like leaflets, guidebooks, interpretation panels, you know, those panels you see around the place, and guided walks, and everything of that kind that sort of tries to engage people with where they are and the sort of spirit of place. So I'd been doing that work with Pembrokeshire Coast, and then I went freelance. So when I was freelance, I was pitching for various jobs and was lucky enough to land this one. And Powys County Council were lovely to work for. There was a really, really nice woman who was their sort of project officer for this, and I worked with a designer based in Brecon, who did the visuals for the leaflet and the production side. So it was a lovely thing to do, and I was really excited about. I'd done a lot of sort of shorter circular walk leaflets for Pembrokeshire Coast National Park when I was employed by them, but those were, you know, shorter trails looking at particularly interesting things within the park, and of course there's also a long distance trail all around the coast of Pembrokeshire. But the Severn Way, the Powys contract, was focusing on a linear walk and, you know, a river walk, to really encourage people to do that route. And I just found that prospect, and obviously I'd have to walk the route myself to understand it, and that was really exciting. I think people are also, something we've become even more aware of since there's been a lot of research on, is green space, this concept of green space as sort of nature and the outdoors, and even urban parks are, you know, small areas of green space that really benefit people's well-being and mental health. But there's also blue space, being near water, and that sense of well-being that water creates. And of course, a river walk like the Severn Way is both. So it's the best of both worlds.
So obviously you wrote 4 different leaflets, starting at the leaflet 1 was I believe, from the source to Llanidloes, is that right?
That's right, yes. Do you want me to go through all the 4, or just?
I would love that, yeah, because, you know, this is where I really nerd out, because I love that whole area.
Yes. Well, no, the first one was the source to Llanidloes, and each leaflet had a particular sort of tagline. So the source of Llanidloes had the tagline "Follow the Legend." So of course we talked about Sabrina and Havren. And then it was Llanidloes to Newtown, and that was a long section, that was about 18 miles. That was called Wander Down the Valley because the Severn Way kind of wanders off away from the river there. Then it was leaflet 3 was Newtown to Welsh Pool, which was along the Montgomery Canal. And the last one was Welsh Pool to England, which was tagged Head for the Border. If you'd like me to say a bit more about the details of all these
Yes, please do. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously the walk to the source is quite challenging.
Yes, and of course you have to sort of walk to the source and then back again. So if you're, as you know, if you've done it, if you're trying to walk the whole river from the source, you go to Havren Forest from Llanidloes, and you then have to hike up to the source, which is about 3.5 miles from the roadhead in Havren Forest. And then you can actually see the source, which again, as you know, is, I mean, it's not that spectacular, but it's kind of lovely. It sort of oozes out of boggy moorland. And then there's a flagstone path. It's quite an easy. It's uphill or downhill on the other way, obviously, but it is quite a good path. And on the way, so then you sort of start the walk properly and come back down again. And there's a standing stone there that's probably Bronze Age that you pass, obviously showing the importance of that landscape to people thousands of years ago. There's also old mine workings that you pass, which possibly also go back to the Bronze Age. And then you come into Havren Forest, that's Severn Forest itself is managed by Natural Resources Wales, so there's picnic side, car park, toilets. It's quite a honeypot site, but it's also got some really good short trails which are waymarked and some very accessible trails which are suitable for wheelchairs, for pushchairs. So it's a lovely place for the truly inclusive, and that people can enjoy even if they don't either not inclined or not able to hike up to the source. From the forest, you then, it's country lanes really to walk to Llanidloes, which is a lovely little town. So obviously I was doing this in 4 days, so I then stayed in a B&B in Llanidloes, and then set off the next day. And the next day from Llanidloes to Newtown, as I said, that's quite a lot. So, sorry, the first stretch is about 12 miles. Second stretch is about 18 miles. And you start off going up through woodlands. And before you know it, you sort of feel you've lost the river because you're up in the valley above, looking down on the Severn Valley. And the route more or less stays like that all the way to Newtown, except at sort of about halfway along, it comes down and pays a visit to the river again around Llandinam and Cardiff, and then it goes off again. And it's one of those situations where obviously they couldn't negotiate permission to run the route all the way along the river, and it's always a complicated factor with river walks, because you've got bits of the riverbank owned by all sorts of different landowners, and when you're trying to create a river path, you've got to negotiate every bit along the way, and it's often easy where possible to use existing public rights of way and footpaths where possible, or which can often mean it's often a sort of uneasy compromise where the walk departs quite a long way from the river, and that's certainly true of the Llanidloes to Newtown route. It's quite a big thing. It's something actually the Right to Roam campaign is very concerned with at the moment, that there are so few river walks that actually stick close to the riverbank all the way, because of this issue of land ownership and access. But you've also probably heard that the government has just announced 9 new river walks being created. And I think there's certainly the first one, which has just been announced in the Manchester area. That's very much just using existing paths and just sort of linking them up, but enhancing them in one way or another. But yeah, there is a big issue about access to riversides in England and Wales, certainly. Not Scotland, because they have right of responsible access all over all land in Scotland, which is pretty good. And then the third section, Newtown to Welshpool, goes entirely along the Montgomery Canal, and that's using mostly an existing old towpath, very old in some cases. The canal was created in about the late 1700s to early 1800s, and it was very much a working waterway, of course. And it was a working waterway right up to after the Second World War, and it only finally closed in the 40s, in the 1940s. And then it was derelict for a long time. So the early part walking out of Newtown, you see some ruined locks, which are quite sort of picturesque. And you'd think, okay, because it was derelict for so many years, it would look like an industrial wasteland. But what's really exciting about that is that nature has really colonized it. Plants and animals have really come back, and about half the length of the canal between Newtown and Welshpool is now a triple SI, a site of special scientific interest. And there are 4 little nature reserves along the length, which you just do a little bit of a detour off the canal, and you can see these lovely nature reserves which have dragonflies and otters and things. So it's surprising. You're expecting, a derelict canal, and then it's really a rich enclave for nature. And it's also some of the villages and the old locks along it are quite beautiful. It's been very largely restored, and I'm sure restoration work has gone on even more actively since I was there. So it's used obviously not as a working waterway now, but as a leisure waterway with people with canal boats and so on. So it's unexpectedly beautiful. It's not actually the Severn River, but it's where the Severn Way goes, and parts of it, certainly the first part, are very close to the actual river. As you go along, the route of the canal and the route of the river are further apart. Obviously, the canal was built to be straighter because it's a section where the Severn meanders and wiggles along the floodplain. So it was for working as a working waterway. It was obviously they wanted something straighter. But it's a really interesting, historically, it's a really interesting section. And then you come on to Welshpool, and the 4th section, which is again a slightly shorter section, that's about 11 miles from Welshpool to England, to the border. And that's completely different again. Now, each of these sections has a really different feel. So the English, the section to the border just feels really quiet. So you go out on the first bit out of Welshpool is still the canal, and then you depart the canal, and it stays really close to the river on this bit. You're back, you feel you've rediscovered the river, rejoined the river. But it's a very different kind of river. It's along farmland. It's very, very wiggly, wonderful wiggles along this bit. It's got muddy banks. It's so different from this sense of, sort of straightness and human control that you have on the Montgomery Canal. And it just sort of weaves along among farmland. You can see the Brython Hills in the background, but otherwise it's very flat. And works its way towards Shrewsbury, you would get to if you crossed the border and carried on. It's actually the last place on the Welsh side is a little village called, a very English name, Crew Green. And then there's an old railway bridge which no longer has a railway on it. It has a minor country road on it. And that's the border, which, it doesn't really look like a border at all. And then because the leaflets were really just about they were about the Welsh section, there I stopped. I would love to go back and do the rest one day and just continue, which you'd head then to Shrewsbury would be your next stop, I guess. And then, well, like you've done, much more of the whole route all the way down to Bristol. Yeah, it would be a wonderful thing to do.
Yeah, and I think you've really captured there the different, like you say, each section is very different, and that's so true along the whole of the route of the river, really. With it being such a long river, there is so much diversity in the landscape to explore, which makes it such a fascinating river. But you mentioned there, and I just smiled to myself in remembering when I went to Crew Green, the village you mentioned, and that the old war bridge, they call it, in the village, and I believe it's one end of the bridge are in Wales and the other end of the bridge are in England, which I felt was quite an interesting kind of concept, really, and spent some time there. There's a lovely village nearby called Malverley with a really old church in it as well. But that's very near where the confluence of the Severn Way River has with the Severn as well. So, it's a very changing river, so many different landscapes to enjoy all the way down. And I'm always saying to people that it's such a contrast from at the source, where it's so clear and it's such a different environment, to where I am, which is down by the estuary, which is so vast and has this real industrial feel with the docks at Avonmouth and these huge shipping containers and all of these kind of nuclear power stations and things. And it's so interesting to comprehend the journey the river takes. But it's a thoroughly enjoyable walking route, and I really do encourage everybody to get out and walk near the Severn as often as possible, and for the reasons you've already said, which is the well-being aspect of it.
The well-being aspect of being in nature, walking in nature, is so important. It's also really important to try and make that as accessible as possible.
Definitely.
And one of the issues that people have been, kind of really agonizing about for about the last 2 decades is those issues of perhaps those benefits and that well-being not being available to everybody, and all sorts of reasons why people don't, some people can't access this. I mean, even somewhere like Severn Forest, which is lovely and it's really nicely looked after, and there's wheelchair accessible trails and a car park and toilets, but there's no public transport there. So if you haven't got a car or you can't afford a taxi, you don't have access to Severn Forest. And that's one of the economic barriers that can prevent people enjoying the benefits that nature and river walks can give. And then, of course, there are a load of other more complex factors, like sort of social and cultural issues, people just feeling that the countryside isn't for them, or that they wouldn't be welcome, or they wouldn't know what to do, or that worried that you have to behave in a certain way or dress in a certain way. And there's been a huge amount of work by the organisations that manage the countryside. I've been involved with quite a lot of projects of that kind, trying to do outreach work with communities and encourage them to engage with the countryside. But, I think the only thing that really, really works properly is communities deciding themselves they want to do it. And it's fantastic to see that recently there are organisations like Black Girls Hike and the Muslim Hikers, which have relatively recently been hugely successful and hugely popular, and are avoiding that kind of slightly, I guess, well-meaning but patronising aspect of national parks or countryside organisations wanting to kind of fix it all for them, if you see what I mean. But it's still something. There's a lot of work still to be done on improving accessibility. I said even something as seemingly practical and obvious as public transport to Severn Forest. I guess the other thing I wanted to pick up on, you were talking about the diversity of the river itself along its whole length. One thing that really struck me at the time, and thinking again now, looking back to the walk and the route and the leaflets, that strikes me really forcibly is how the river is interconnected with human activity and human life all along its source, right from walking down from the source as you pass a Bronze Age standing stone, and then mining, which was definitely a small-scale lead mine in the 19th century, but possibly goes back thousands of years more than that. Through Havering Forest. Havering Forest itself was planted in the 1930s by the Forestry Commission for timber. Nowadays, it's just a recreation site, but and then along through the canal, that whole stretch along the Montgomery Canal, which was a working waterway, bringing trade to Newtown. It linked up with the Shropshire Union Canal network, so it was really major. I mean, that was like the motorways of its day. And it just puts me in mind of how we relate to rivers nowadays, because it's very easy for this relationship with them that's been sort of economically and socially beneficial to people to go too far. You know, you talked about the docks near your end of the Severn on the estuary and nuclear power stations and so on. And I'm minded about Robert Macfarlane's latest book that was published, I was going to say this year, I should say last year, 2025, which you probably know about, called Is a River Alive? And it's a real sort of rallying call for rivers being treated with a lot more respect, and respect for humans' relationship with rivers, but in a way that realizes that rivers have rights in themselves. And it's, to be honest, I feel very almost sort of conflicted about this, because if I'm studying a river and looking at some history, and I love that it's been so interconnected with human life all along its route, you know, since the Bronze Age. It gives a sense of really how much the river has done for people. You know, people have been the beneficiaries of the river. But then you get to a stage where, as Macfarlane says, it's become sort of exploitative and monetized, so that a lot of the big international projects of damming, putting dams on rivers for hydropower or for water control, which have, you know, destroyed communities and disrupted lives, and especially, you know, to the disadvantage of indigenous communities. So there's an awful lot of issues there, which you know, I'm sure are relevant to the Severn, but it's really, yeah, it's complicated. I mean, there's this there's the Rights of Rivers movement. There's the Universal Declaration of River Rights, which isn't an official. It's not like the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It's been produced by non-government organisations. But one district council in England, in Sussex, has actually made a declaration of river rights for the Ouse, the Sussex River Ouse. And that's the first river in the UK that's been accorded these rights. I mean, you know, it's not yet legally enforceable, but I think it's a fascinating sign of perhaps we're moving towards having a bit more respect for rivers and acknowledging how much they've done for us.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. And the simple things in life are really good to get that connection back. So just gentle walking, you know, a visit out to the river, or you know, with the family at the weekends, things like that. Everybody gets fresh air and exercise, but it's also calming, isn't it? And it's going through the seasons. You see the different wildfowl and the different birds that are there, and the flora and fauna honour of the environments as well. And of course, I'm very lucky to live in the area where we get the Severn boar, you know, and things like that. So there's a lot to go and see that's interesting. It's just getting people to engage, isn't it? And I think that's part of what you're talking about. Your work has been very much about social engagement, you know, with these kind of outdoor environments.
Yes, definitely. And I think the more that organisations can do to make the outdoors accessible, but also to deepen that somehow. I mean, the job I used to do as an interpretation officer or interpretation consultant was very much about enjoyment and appreciation and understanding. There was this little mantra which actually originated from the United States National Park Service long ago, when the United States National Park Service used to be something really good before politics got in the way. And it was taking interpretation as this, providing guided walks or panels or leaflets and things, but it was through interpretation, understanding, through understanding, appreciation, through appreciation, protection. So that's people wanting themselves to protect. I don't like the idea that nature needs to be protected from people. I'm very much against that. I see, we are part of nature as, again, I try to avoid saying people and nature, because it's people and the rest of nature, because we're part of it. But there's a lot of really good stuff being done. And one of the things I did when my son was small was run a wildlife watch group, which was for kids aged 8 to 12, and it was part of the Wildlife Trust network, and we would just organise little activities once a month where they somehow engaged with nature. And we've got the Forest Schools movement, which I think is fantastic. So there's a lot of initiatives going on, but I absolutely agree with you that we have lost that sense of connection, and that's what leads to exploitation by industry, capitalist interests of the sort that I know the Rights of Rivers movement is trying to counteract, or at least stand up against. But there's there's lots of ways of doing that. I mean, people can campaign. I am also sort of connected with the Right to Roam movement, but then, as you say, there's so many other things, like just encouraging people to get out for a family walk at the weekend. I mean, there was a bit of a sense of underwhelm about the first of the 9 river walks in England that the government has just announced. The first one is in the Manchester area, and it's very much using existing footpaths, and it's only 13 miles. So people were a bit underwhelmed, but that is probably what's going to be really accessible to people living nearby. It'll be people living in Manchester, people living in Stockport can get to it really easily, and there'll be as much enhancement of the area for nature as they can manage. So quite, for people who love long distance walks and just stomping over moorland like me, it's easy to be a bit sniffy about sort of 13 miles along a fairly tame river near Manchester. But I think it's going to be really, really good for people who perhaps aren't connected with nature to make first steps in really connecting with that, introduction to a river. It is part of the Mersey, so it's just a small part of a major river. But the focus on rivers for the Right to Roam movement is pretty new. It's sort of been since about last autumn, and various different branches, different local groups have been, first of all, sort of mapping the land ownership rights along the banks of their local rivers, which is often quite difficult to find out who owns which bit. Lots of research. So that's being done on a sort of patchwork basis where people are able to get that information. And then they've and also a number of local groups have been doing a sort of river trespass, so walking along the whole of a riverbank where there are bits of the riverbank that you're not supposed to walk on. Yeah, so that is very much a current focus. And I think because it's one of the big, well, perhaps in response to the government saying, well, we're going to give you some river walks, and the right of way movement saying, well, yeah, river walks and not really going to do much towards a much wider right of access. Yeah.
It's a very interesting perspective, because we collaborate with lots of different groups, but we hadn't really sort of thought the Right to Roam community would be. It's just interesting, and that they're focusing on that as well. But yeah, no, that's very interesting to me. Thank you for that. But yeah, just going back to the Severn Way. Obviously, it was a while ago, but just sort of a bit of a reflection, really. What were some of the highlights or some of the favourite places that you visited on that journey of researching those walking leaflets?
It's a hard question because I loved all of it. I think possibly Havern Forest adopted the source, because I love forests and I love moorland. When you're going up onto the sort of shoulders of Plinlimmon, it feels really wild, even though the path to the source is a really, really well-defined path. And there's something about a source as well. I'm fascinated by the source of the Derwent River, my local river now. And I love, the forest is lovely too. But I also had a kind of sneaking affection for that last bit from Welsh Pool right to the English border, which is such a little known bit, and it's so quiet. I don't think I saw anybody on that bit of the route when I walked it. And the river's really, really wiggly, and it's going along the floodplain, so it clearly overfills its banks frequently. There are some of the areas actually on raised flood banks, and then it kind of discreetly slips across the border in a very sort of gently purposeful way. So there was something quite special about it as well. But then the two bits in between were nice as well. I did a little bit on the Llanidloes to Newtown walk, most of which is well above the river, well away from the river, just looking down on the river valley. And I did at times along there feel quite annoyed that the route was taking me so far from the river. I'm quite annoyed with probably all those pesky landowners who had said to Powys County Council, no, we can't route this, you can't route this thing through my land. But it is still a beautiful walk, and there's a couple of really lovely woodland along it. And when you come up above Newtown, there's a mixed woodland set up on the hill, and there's a lovely sort of forest pool, and then you come there looking down on Newtown and onto the town. And that's something lovely about kind of leaving the woods and then walking down to a town that you can see far below you in the distance. So lots of highlights, really.
Amazing. And what time of year did you do the walks? Was this mostly through the summer months? Was it hot weather, or so it would have had you would have seen quite a lot of flora and fauna along the routes as well?
Early summer, yes. Yeah. I don't like walking in horrible weather. Confessing now to being a wimp. I just find walking with the sun, feeling the sun on your skin, and not having to worry about what you're going to do with all your wet clothes when you get to the Indy at the end of the day. I mean, I will do it if I'm on a linear walk and there's no choice, and the first day you set off and it's fine, and then you stay overnight in a B&B or a campsite, and the next day it is chucking it down and you have to go on. But I was pretty lucky on this route, and each day was, it was early summer, and so the colours were lovely. I mean, some people really like autumn colours. I guess it would have been really beautiful in autumn as well, at least the woody bits. But I think when you've got a windy, meandering river going through fields and farmland, that just looks gorgeous in summer. And the canal was interesting in summer, as early summer, so you still had, you know, quite a lot of waterfowl, to say. As the summer sort of starts to get late and tip into autumn, you see the green, the foliage loses its kind of really lustrous greenness a bit, and you can see it starting going towards autumn, and then quite a number of birds may have moved off by then. So I think it's a good time. I would say that sort of, you know, April, May is a really good time to do it. When did you do it? When did you walk with your
January.
Oh my God! Oh right.
I suppose one of the questions that I ask all my guests is, do you think you developed a sort of a connection with the River Severn, with your, you know, with your experience with her, as I call her, a herd? You know, did you feel a spiritual sense to the river at all?
Perhaps not explicitly spiritual, but very much in line with a sense of connection I have with, I think, you know, nature quite widely. And obviously each river is special. I feel a sense of connection now to the Derbyshire Derwent. I think, so for me, it wouldn't be explicit recognition of a goddess, but certainly a sense of some, I'm going to quote Wordsworth, if you'll allow me to. I'd love Wordsworth's poem Tintern Abbey, which is written on the banks of the Wye, sort of sister river to the Severn. And he talks about feeling a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns and the round ocean and the living air and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thoughts, and rolls through all things. So that's kind of sums up really nicely how I felt about Severn, but not wanting to sound disloyal to the Severn, that's also how I feel about a lot of places in nature.
And so, obviously, you mentioned that your work now is dedicated to the River Derwent in Derbyshire. So, what are you working on now, and what does, you know, what's your future projects going to be?
I am working on a book about the River Derwent, and I'm going to be walking, well, I have already walked from the source, but I'll be re-walking numerous times all the various sections of it and talking to people along the way and capturing stories of the connections that different people have with different sections of the Derwent. And it's a really interesting river because it doesn't go to the sea. So it sort of pootles along in a generally southward direction, and then it joins the Trent. And when it joins the Trent, it's then carried all the way back up on itself, up to where the Trent joins the Humber, and then it joins the sea. So I have this lovely sense of the Derwent as just doing its own thing and pootling along, and it's not going to the sea. It's just sort of living in the moment without a frantic sense of purpose. So a bit like the Severn, in that Severn wanted to go and visit all the most interesting places on the way. But the Severn does get to sea eventually, and the Derwent just goes to the Trent. But it's still fascinating. And like the Severn, it's so hugely different, the different sections of it.
And it's lovely to hear the warmth that you have for the Derwent as well. And I think it's a really important thing to reflect on, how these rivers can really affect us, and we can become very much in kinship with them, and build a friendship almost with the river. And when people talk about their favourite river, they get very starry-eyed, and they get very they get this romantic look in them, and they just think, oh, it's such a wonderful thing. And I just think that's lovely. I think that's that you've got this passion for the Derwent, and all of that, and that's motivated you to want to write a book, and that's quite a big thing to do. So I will look forward to reading that. So please let me know when it comes out. But yeah, no, thank you ever so much for coming on the podcast. That's been really interesting to hear about all that.
Great, thank you, Nick. Thanks very much.
Many thanks to Margi for coming on the podcast. For more information about walking the Severn Way, please look online.